Hello everybody, Raven Knight here, and I've got a treat for you guys today. So about 3 years ago, I did a video called Ranking For Honor's Deadliest Warrior. It was a two-part video where I took all the For Honor heroes and ranked them from least deadly to the most deadly, and we had a lot of fun going over it. I basically looked at their armor, their weapons, their culture, their fighting tactics, all of it, and said which one was the deadliest overall in a realistic fighting sense. It was a lot of fun. But since then, For Honor has changed a lot. New heroes have been added, new weapons have been added, like it's a new game, so to speak. So people have been telling me, Raven, don't you think you should update this list now? Don't you think we need to have a more accurate, updated list of who is the deadliest in For Honor? And I thought about it, and I said, all right, let's do that. So Lark and I sat down and spent a long time discussing it. We looked over all the heroes, we looked at their weapons, we looked at their armors, we talked about their fighting styles, what's going to be useful, what's not, and we finally came away and said, all right, this is going to ruffle a lot of feathers, this is going to upset a lot of people because some of our choices may not make a lot of sense, but that's why we're here to make this video today. I'm going to sit down with you guys and explain our brand new, updated, deadliest For Honor hero list. We're going to go from the least deadly all the way up to the most deadly, and I will explain in painstaking detail our reasonings for each one. Now, there are 3 criteria you need to understand before we go further. Number 1, we will only be looking at the default armor and weapon sets for the heroes. The reason for this is because we can't account for any new armor or weapon sets that are added on later. For example, I could look at the best armor set existing right now for one character and say this makes them best for X reason, but then a brand new armor set could come out for another character which is objectively better than the previous one I just said was best, and thus the entire list has to be adjusted. Looking at the default weapon set gives us a very clear and easy to understand objective metric to look at for all heroes, okay? Okay. Second thing to keep in mind is that a lot of this is going to come down to me and Lark and our experience and understanding of the characters and their history. If you disagree with our take, you are absolutely 100% free to, but please don't insult us. We had a lot of people insult us in the last one, so understand that this is where we're coming from. And then third and finally, this is all for the sake of fun. We're having a good time with this. We hope you guys have a good time too. Okay? Oh, one more thing. We're not going to take into account any feats or executions. Some people are probably going to look at some of the feats and executions of heroes and assume that they will be brought into play here, like how Zanhu can summon fire out of nowhere, how Shugoki can apparently shatter someone's entire skull by sitting on it in an execution, or how Ocelot can come back to life and be a ghost. None of that's coming into play here. We're only looking at realistic capabilities of the armor and weapons and the cultures of those heroes and how they fought and what they were trying to do. That is our goal here, okay? Alright, enough preamble, let's get into the list. Number 34, Shinobi. Alright, I know this is contentious, but hear me out on this. First of all, Shinobi is lacking in meaningful protective armor. They don't have enough armor that really means much in terms of defense, and in a knockdown, drag-out fight, that's going to come back to haunt them. Number 2, their weapon set. The common weapon set, I would argue, is a very impractical weapon. In order to use it properly, you need to do puncture work. You need to take the tip of that blade and punch it into an opponent's body and hope that it hits something vital. If you miss a vital spot, it's just a puncture wound, it's a flesh wound, it's not going to mean all that much. So you have to make sure you're precise with this weapon. But in order to even get that precision, you need to be in super close, which is not good for the Shinobi who is not wearing armor to compensate. The cutting portion of the blade is on the underside of the blade, which means that in order to get any meaningful cut, you need to place the blade around the other side of where you want to hit and then slide it around, and that's not going to get a lot of depth. It's going to be a minor laceration. It's not going to be very deep. You're not going to see a whole lot of decapitations with this weapon like they show in the game. It's just not a practical weapon. As a Kusarigama, first of all, this Kama is not crafted like a real Kusarigama, and we are not even talking about a real Kusarigama. And for those of you wondering, well, what if we were? Well, what if the sky fell on our head? You know, we can play the what if game all we want. But if this was a Kusarigama, we'd talk about it differently, and he might be a little higher on the list. I'd still have questions. But this set, not even physically possible. They treat it like a yo-yo. He can just throw his Kama at his opponent and retract it back. Not how that works physically. But let's even pretend it did. Let's leave physics aside for a second and assume this could work exactly like they advertise. How? How are you going to do this? Like, you're going to throw it, and you've got to hope that it hits something vital, and then hope that it goes deep enough to actually do any meaningful damage, and then retract it back. I don't know. I don't know, dude. I mean, think about it. If you throw the Kama and it actually went deep enough to cause damage, wouldn't you have a hard time pulling it out? I don't know. I think that this is a very impractical weapon set. Here's the biggest problem, though. My biggest problem with Shinobi being on this list. Shinobi are spies more than they are warriors. I mean, not that they can't assassinate. They did. But think about that. Assassinations. Assassinations means stealth. Assassinations means that you sneak up on your opponent and do damage to them in the dark. You kill them from behind. You don't let them see you coming. And in those discussions, yeah, I think Shinobi comes out pretty well. But this is a fight between warriors. This is a knockdown, throwdown fight. Even if it was just a duel, one-on-one, the Shinobi might do okay, but more likely the Shinobi wants to get out of there. He wants to escape, regroup, and then plan his attack better next time. If Shinobi is put on the battlefield, where stealth is no longer his ally, and he has been exposed, and the enemy knows where he is, Shinobi is in trouble. His weapons are not good defensively, he does not have armor with which to keep himself safe, and in order to be deadly with his weapons at all, he needs to get in exceptionally close. I'm sorry, Shinobi's just not looking good here. Sorry guys, I know Shinobi's cool, but Deadliest Warrior he is not. Number 33, Shaolin. I debated putting Shaolin on the bottom of the list behind Shinobi because of several reasons, which we'll get into, but I did change my mind for one reason, and again, we'll get into it. First of all, lacking in armor. Shaolin comes in with very minimal armor for protection, but what I will give him is the staff can be used a bit more defensively than the Kama can be. You can actually use the shaft of the staff to protect yourself, which I wouldn't even say the Kama can do very well. However, the big problem with the staff is it's not a lethal weapon by nature. In order to make it lethal, you had to put weights on the end of the staff, so that's already difficult. You know, you're taking this weapon that was not meant to kill and turning it into something that might kill or could kill given the application of force. And then there's another problem, and I got a lot of hate for this in my last video, so let me clarify my point here. I am well aware that there are warrior monks in history. I'm well aware that the Shaolin did go into battle to fight on occasion. I'm aware of that. But I'm saying, as a general rule, the Buddhist code prevents the Shaolin from wanting to kill the opponent. You could give two guys a gun, but the guy who doesn't want to kill is less likely to kill. You know, he's less likely to pull that trigger. They could both have very equal damaging weapons, but the one who is avoiding killing is not likely to kill. That's my point there. Now, with that said, I will agree, we need to take that aspect to the side a little bit, because this Shaolin monk clearly wants to kill. He's on the battlefield, so his role is to kill. If he's found himself on the battlefield, he needs to do what he needs to do. With that said, of the weapons you could have brought to a battlefield Shaolin, you chose an odd one. Even if it is a weighted tip, you have better weapons at your disposal than this. So I think this was a poor choice. So, why did he come out ahead of Shinobi? Because I think that the staff, while not necessarily a killing tool in its own right, has been modified to be a more likely killing tool, and despite him being a pacifist by nature, I think that Shaolin has proven themselves a martial force to be reckoned with on the battlefield, so with a weapon that has been modified to do more damage, and an intent to kill this time, Shaolin will probably do better than Shinobi. The problem is the lack of armor, and a weapon that just is not meant for killing in general is not going to help him here in the long run. I know a lot of people love Shaolin. I love Shaolin. I'm very big on the Wukong monkey boy kind of style and aesthetic. But in terms of Deadliest Warrior, I'm sorry, Shaolin probably isn't going to take the top spot. Number 32, Ocelot. Again, lack of armor for adequate protection, and you're going to hear me say that a lot for a lot of these bottom tier characters. Because he has so minimal armor, it means that in the battlefield he's going to get hit and he's going to feel it. Now, I do know that historically speaking, Ocelot warriors did have better armor than this. They did have more advanced armor than this, but we're talking about how they appear in game, what their default armor looks like, and quite frankly, this Jaguar pelt just isn't going to cut it. They use largely organic weaponry, which makes for poor offensive strength against armored opponents. Now, granted, the use of a spear and club is better than what we've seen so far, but they are made of wood and obsidian stone, which is not going to be very good against armored enemies. They have no defensive tools at their disposal to compensate for the lack of armor, and the dual wielding of a club and spear makes for very lopsided combat. If they had a club and shield or a spear and shield to make up for this defense, then that would be excellent, and they might even go up a little higher on the list. But because they have this lopsided full offensive tool, which doesn't have a lot of defensive capability, that's going to lead to a lot of problems. Plus, historically, one of the big problems you had with these organic weapons is they broke apart easily. You get one really solid swing with that maquito, that club, and it hits the opponent. You may end up with a lot of the obsidian shards coming out of the club, which just turns it into a blunt instrument, not a cutting tool at that point. Now, I know that in game they don't come out as easily, but I'm talking about from a realistic standpoint. They come out ahead of Shinobi because I do see the maquito and the spear as being just better overall as weapons in terms of lethality than what the Shinobi's bringing, but their lack of armor really hurts them here. The use of organic weaponry is not going to help them here, and the fact remains, a lot like Shinobi, they're going to have a lot more luck in the stealth kind of game. They're going to be much better in a jungle setting where they can use their camouflage and knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. But in this open kind of fighting in Heathmoor where you got castles and Viking strongholds and samurai strongholds, they're not going to be in their element, and that's going to put them at a huge disadvantage. So sorry, Ocelot. Number 31, Magi. Okay, say it with me, folks. Overall lacking in armor for protection. Magi comes in with a bare chest and not a lot of armor to protect him. The weapon, though, does have range and versatility. Its ability to switch between a staff mode and a two-handed fighting mode is very cool. It's also going to give him a definite reach advantage, but there's a couple of problems. The first is, while it looks cool, it's not the best for lethal use. I talked about this in Magi's video, but I'll explain it again here. The crescent shape of the fan blade means that you're going to get decent length of cut. You're not going to get a lot of depth of cut. And that's something you can see with a weapon or tool like a pendulum. It's just not going to be able to get the depth of cut that you really, really want. Plus, I have a lot of questions about how the staff stays attached if it can so easily be detached in battle. What's to say you don't grab one end of the staff and swing with all your might and then the other end just comes off and flies away? That's not cool. I want to know how they'd stay attached so easily. Some of you may say that's nitpicking. I say it's being precise. I say it's understanding the method of the weapon and how it's used and how it's maintained and how it operates. Plus, there's another problem. The staff mode is lopsided because you run the risk of hurting yourself with one end if you swing the other end at your opponent. And even if you detach it and use it as two different-ended weapons, again, you have that issue of the cutting potential. But then at that point, why not just use two axes? The Egyptians had axes. You could just hand them a pair of axes and it'd be just as good. Plus, you sacrifice that reach advantage that you had with the staff mode. And without the armor to compensate, that loss of reach is going to be a major problem for you. I feel like there's just too many problems here. It makes the weapon overly complicated. And an overly complicated weapon is going to cause a lot more issues at the end of the day. It's not that I don't like Magi. I think there's a lot of cool stuff you could do. I think it would have been smarter to give them an Egyptian saber or an axe of some kind in their shield. I think that would have been a much smarter decision. But, c'est la vie, it is what it is. Magi, sorry bro, you're not going to be at the top of this list. Number 30, Kyoshin. Lacking an armor for adequate protection, and in the case of the first armor set, a partial blindfold, which will hinder vision, which I don't think is a cool idea. I think it looks neat. I think it's very much falling in line with the pop culture view of the lone samurai warrior that so many people like in anime and the like, but it just doesn't work here. The single blade with limited reach provides for decent attack power. However, second hand holding the scabbard as a defensive tool is a risky choice. Using the scabbard that you're carrying as your protection is not a good idea, especially if you're using it one-handed. It's not going to be much good against stronger or heavier weapons that swing at it. And then following up with a cutting weapon like what you get, it's just not going to work as well, I'm afraid. It's not going to get the depth of cut that you're going to want, and if you want that depth of cut, you're going to need to just drop the scabbard altogether and wield that thing two-handed, but then at that point, you're just going full Orochi mode, so not really the best looking here. Plus, without the armor that Orochi has, Kyoshin's just way too exposed, and I think that's a big problem. Now, some may say, wouldn't the Kaze stance be of use there? And I'll be real, if you think the Kaze stance is any meaningful defense against a really powerful attack, you're fooling yourself. The Kaze stance, while it looks cool, is more mesmerizing than it is effective. I can tell you this much right now. If you're swinging a blade around in a rotating pattern around yourself and an enemy longsword hits that, all it's going to do is break the momentum of your twirl. That's pretty much all it's going to do. So Kyoshin, I'm afraid, isn't going to get a lot of points here. So sorry, Kyoshin. Number 29, Zordan Gund. Again, a severe lack of armor for protection, although granted, probably a little bit more than what Kyoshin or some of the others are bringing. But the real problem that Zordan Gund has is the weapon. It's a huge, cumbersome, and crude hammer that shows a lot of weight in the way they wield it. It has limited range as well. This hammer has very limited range. You would never see a hammer like this on the battlefield. War hammers that were actually used usually had a hook on one end and a hammer on the other, and they were usually pretty lightweight so that they could be used like a mace, almost like a whiplash kind of strike. This looks more like what you'd give a blacksmith, or of course what you'd see Thor carrying, because that's what it's modeled after. Though the hammer will find some success in a direct blow, like if you took this two-handed and swung it at an opponent, oh, it's going to make them think. This could probably break a bone. It could probably even do some damage to an opponent wearing armor. The problem is the weight of this thing. It looks like it's a heavy sledgehammer-style weapon, and the weight and cumbersome nature of this weapon means that you're going to have to get in up close and use a lot of power to get the kind of damage you want. And in doing so, you expose yourself to an opponent counterattack if they dodge, evade, or take the hit and move on, especially with your more armored opponents coming up. And the lack of armor is just not going to help Jormungandr at all. Keep in mind, Jormungandr in the default has very limited armor and, in fact, are barefoot. That's just opening themselves up to Gladiator, isn't it? That toe-loving fetishist. But whatever the case, the lacking of armor and just a very cumbersome, unwieldy weapon puts him at a huge disadvantage. I give him a bit more credit than Kyoshin because, at the very least, the weapon, I think, will be far more effective in bludgeoning and damaging an opponent. Plus, they're wearing a bit more armor than Kyoshin, so that is something. But overall, Jormungandr is just not going to come up high on this one. Number 28, Shaman. Lacking of armor for protection again, but the short-range hatchet and dagger weapon provide for an easy-to-use weapon set, and it's also a very familiar one, so the hatchet and dagger set is actually very optimal. But the lack of range means up-close and personal fighting, which their lack of armor will not assist with. Resilience and reliance on wild and unpredictable fighting tactics will help in the short term, but mad pouncing is an easy way to be killed in combat. Now, some would say, what about the biting of the throat and ripping out of the throat? While the human jaw can do this and the teeth are capable of it, against more armored opponents coming up, that's going to be very difficult, and you're also assuming the opponent won't just wrestle you off and fight back. Shaman is not well armored to be able to deal with most of the opponent's weapons coming up later, and plus the wild nature of Shaman's fighting tactics, they won't be reliable for the long-term fight, like I said. So frankly, while I do think Shaman is superior to Kyoshin for a superior weapon combination, and for just the overall unpredictable factor, in a long-term fight, and because of the lack of armor, Shaman's not going to come out on top in much of these matchups. So sorry, Shaman, but you're definitely better than a couple. Number 27, Aramusha. Say it with me, lacking in armor for adequate protection and an encumbering hat that provides no head protection. If the hat provided any kind of head protection, I'd like it more, but let's face it, there is very little that hat is going to do to protect him. Dual wielding provides for an extra attack weapon, but also can become cumbersome in prolonged battles. Now, I know there are a lot of people who want to point out that dual wielding katana is not impossible. It is something that can be done, and I don't disagree. The problem is, as someone who has tried to train using dual wielding katanas, it is not as easy as you'd think, and it can become very cumbersome and difficult to do for long periods of time. Plus, that blade blockade thing that you saw is pretty much fiction. You're not going to be able to pull that off in most situations. I do think that while the Aramusha has a range advantage with the use of katana, and it provides with extra cutting capabilities and provides options, as the battle continues to draw on and on and on, it's going to get tiresome. Plus, without the armor to protect themselves, like what we see with Orochi or Kensei later, it's just not going to mean a whole lot for them. They are wearing too little armor to make up for it, and while the blades are cool, it's just not going to be what they really need to take over. Range, however, does give an advantage over Shaman, so I do have to give him that at least. So that is why I think Aramusha takes this 27 spot. Number 26, Berserker. Actually having some marginal armor here on the shoulders, but still severely lacking, especially in the chest department. Dual-wielding axes is unwieldy and risky to perform. In fact, I'd argue it's even more risky and unwieldy than to use dual katanas or dual wakizashis like what the Aramusha is using, but they would be considerably more effective than dual-wielding weapons that we've seen so far. Axes have a lot of stopping power and can do a lot of hacking and in-deep striking, so if you could get a very strong, powerful swing with any one of those axes, you could do even more damage than I think the katanas would do. If given drug fueling as well, because if you think about what the Berserkers were, the legend says that they would get hyped up on drugs or mushrooms. That adds fuel to their strength, which could add even more devastation to it, and could further add to their tenacity and bloodlust. I don't think that they have the armor to really make up for this, though. I think that they're lacking in armor is going to hurt them against later heroes that we talk about. But I gotta admit, the use of their axes is probably one of the best dual-wielding weapon sets that we've seen so far, even comparable to the katanas. I think that, plus their shoulder protection alone, really does give them an advantage. Number 25, Hitakiri. Lacking in armor again in a big way, but large and powerful weapon that can do significant damage even to armored opponents. Powerful swings allow for devastating chopping power, and more range means difficulty of opponents closing that distance. But the real issue will be long period usage. The Masakari axe in game is large, heavy, and cumbersome. It will wear down the wielder quickly, and you'll notice that in a lot of the attacks that the Hitakiri does, they have to build up some serious momentum to do the kind of damage they want to do. To do meaningful damage means powerful swings combined with momentum. It's not going to look good as the fight draws out, and because they lack the armor to continue to engage in opponents later on, it means that if they miss, if they swing for the fences and don't do it right, they are going to be put in the ground in a serious way. Having bloodlust and tenacity is helpful, but not in the face of superior technology and training. So that is going to hurt them. Number 24, Nusha. Nusha is wearing decent armor for once, probably the first character to actually have some decent armor set, with a weapon set that provides for a degree of decent offense and defense. Hook swords are meant to be dual wielded, giving a unique weapon set to her, but the problem is that the hook swords are not especially deadly and require exceptional skill and time to use effectively. The cool thing about the hook swords is the different ways you can attack. You have the hooks at the bottom, the crescent-shaped handguards, the blade on the back, the hooks to help disarm. There's a lot of options that the hook weapons give you. The problem is that they are not the best for lethality. Again, these are Shaolin style weapons that were more designed to incapacitate or disarm opponents more than they were to kill. Could they kill? Absolutely, but it's going to require more effort. I think the real advantage that Nusha has over a lot of the others is, for one thing, better armor, and for another, the unique versatility that the weapons give her. The problem is that she won't do well against many of the upcoming heroes, because whether or not her weapons are good or not, they're not going to be as good at killing as some of these others. So I think what it comes down to for Nusha is better armor, which puts her above some of the others we've talked about, and really good weapons, but not as good as what we're going to see. So Nusha, you have something really interesting there. I think if you had better armor or maybe a better weapon set, I think you would have done even better. Number 23, Gladiator. Gladiator's wearing decent armor, though he keeps his chest exposed, which is a historically accurate but poor decision in warfare. Weapon set is actually lacking here. The trident provides limited offensive capability and requires precision to achieve a lethal blow, because if you take a trident and you stab in the wrong place, it's going to hurt. But if you don't hit a vital organ or something important, it's just a flesh wound. It's just something that's going to heal up in time, because you only have 3 areas of striking. The buckler is a shield technically, but it acts more as a bludgeoning tool than an actual shield, something you could use to bludgeon or hit your opponent with, almost like a big boxing glove. Combining the up-close striking power of the buckler and the range-skewing potential of the trident provides for versatile attack patterns, but the inconsistency of lethality in the trident means that the gladiator will leave himself exposed more often than not because, again, the lacking in chest protection. Plus, the helmet, here's the thing. You're not going to hear me talk a whole lot about visibility with helmets, but I do want to bring this up here. Some of the helmets that we see on some of the characters in the default have very limited visibility, and keep in mind that the gladiator historically didn't usually want to kill. That wasn't usually the goal in gladiatorial fights. Not that it never happened, but that wasn't the goal. Usually you gave them weapons with which that could maim or hurt or injure the opponent, but not kill, because gladiators, at the end of the day, were show performers. It was a spectator sport. Some of them were slaves, and some of them were doing it to make a quick buck. So quite often, gladiators weren't trying to kill each other, they were just trying to hurt each other, and the trident and buckler or trident and net combination that you often see was emblematic of that. So the problem here is you have a sports performer who's coming in with his gear set onto a battlefield, which isn't going to help him. The reason he does better than Nusha, though, is even though he is lacking in that protective capability, I think the gladiator's trident is going to be more effective than the Nusha's hook swords. Not that the hook swords aren't cool, but the trident is probably going to be a more effective killing tool. Number 22, Nobushi. Boasts excellent reach with her Naginata weapon, but the armor leaves something to be desired. Keeping an opponent at a distance will make up for this lack of adequate armor, because the way I see it, if you're not going to go into battle with a lot of armor, make sure your weapon is going to keep your opponent at a distance. And the Naginata is very useful for striking and slashing at a distance, as well as having some defensive use with the shaft if push comes to shove. However, against armored opponents, some of this will be mitigated, and Nobushi will struggle in such matchups. Quite frankly, the Naginata is just not going to be well adjusted to fighting against highly armored opponents. What it's going to do is keep enemies at a distance, which will buy time, but she's not going to be able to get out the damage she really needs to make any meaningful headway against her opponents. So against all the opponents we've talked about previously, she'll do pretty well. Against the ones coming up, she's going to struggle. Number 21, Zanhu. I put Zanhu and Nobushi pretty close. In fact, it was a very hard decision deciding which one was higher than the other. I think that Zanhu has moderately better chest armor, which helps him out here, but makes up for great range with his blade and versatility of movement. What it comes down to is the blade gives him versatility, it gives him speed, and it gives him reach. And he also does have the chest armor, which does help protect him a little bit more than what Nobushi has. The weight of the blade will also cause longer lacerations that will mean more physical trauma, so I think that helps him here. And no, before anyone asks, I'm not including his pyrotechnics. Those are all feat related, and I don't want to include them because that would be unfair. What I think we should include, though, is his martial skill. The dude is clearly a martial artist, clearly highly trained, but using an excellent weapon that will keep opponents at a distance, allow him quick and nimble movement, and also add enough versatility to his move set that he can handle a lot of opponents at once. I think if he had better armor, he would do much better in the overall lineup. Number 20, Peacekeeper. Far better armor than what we've seen so far, and strong dual weapon set in dagger and short sword, which is a real dual weapon set that you would see historically. Though she requires close combat to get any real damage in, she does have the protection when in tight fights to be able to do this relatively safely. But with that said, range is going to be your greatest challenge. Dexterity and speed are strong assets, but against more armored opponents, Peacekeeper will find herself struggling. Especially when we get into weapons that we'll see later that are designed to go through or counter armor like what she has. Her armor is much lighter than what we see with characters like Warden or Lawbringer later, so because of that, that means that though she is more well protected and would probably do pretty decently against the characters we've talked about previously, she's going to struggle in later combat. Number 19. Raider. Pitiful armor, but boasting a very strong ranged weapon in the Danax. At the very least, he does have a helmet, which will guard from head trauma. But what I really want to talk about is that axe. The axe will be a superior weapon in dealing with armored opponents, as it can do more bludgeoning damage and can still knock over an enemy, opening up for the chance of a deadly blow. To put it simply, even if your armor protects you from the cutting power of the axe, you're going to feel that beast hit you like a freight train, and it's going to make you think twice. However, the real problem is, if all it does is make you think twice, then your second thought will be, oh, well, now I'm going to kill you. So that's not going to be hard to do when Raider lacks necessary armor to protect himself. Many people have pointed it out, but Raider having a chest exposed is not a cool look. It is a very stupid look because it means you are far more likely to die. I actually had a hard time deciding where I wanted to put Raider. In determining where he stood next to Peacekeeper, I thought about putting Peacekeeper ahead of him because she just has better armor. The only reason Raider comes out ahead is because his Danax would be superior to the armor, or light armor as is, that Peacekeeper wears. Number 18, Centurion. Excellent armor for protective use, but very short-range weapon. The Gladiator will not hold up well against heavy armored opponents and forces Centurion to go into close-range fights. And without the shield that Centurions were famous for, they're lacking in a defensive aspect of their kit. Because they have to make up for this lack of defense, they compensate with more offense by going into punching maneuvers. So their armor will be adequate against opponents mentioned so far. In fact, I'd say that their armor is going to be exceptional, but the close-range nature of the Gladius will put them at a disadvantage against other opponents coming up. Not only this, but their legs and arms are a bit exposed, and the face masks they wear create very poor visibility. Those face masks are cavalry face masks. They are not used on foot fighting tactics. Now again, some of you are going to say, well, later armor sets allow him to have his face revealed. I know, but we're going with the default here, so bear with me. I think the real issue we have here is the Gladius is a strong sword, but it's very short range, and though they do have good armor, it's not going to be as useful against what's coming up. Number 17, Orochi. Excellent armor coverage and solid weapon. Fast and versatile movement allow for quick strikes and retreat tactics, with good protection if caught off guard. The katana, though, will struggle against more well-armored opponents overall. The katana is a good slashing weapon, but it is not the end-all to beat-all sword. I think one of the things that we have that's a problem for Orochi is people are going to buy into the whole idea that the Orochi's katana is just the super awesome, highly flexible, highly powerful weapon that's going to do a lot of damage to a lot of people. And the problem is, while it is a good sword, it is not going to be as good against what's coming up. In fact, I would go so far as to say that they balance good mobility and protection, and they're adequate in a lot of areas, but they're not exceptional in any. What I see when I see Orochi is decent defense, decent offense, decent mobility, but they're not getting any A+ in anything. Adequate in everything, but not exceptional in any. And I think that's a big problem that Orochi faces, and why they're kind of here in the middle tier. Number 16, Highlander. Long range and pretty good armor. Though the Claymore sword in real life isn't this cumbersome, the cumbersome nature that we see in game demonstrates a heavy weight that could wear down the warrior. The weight may even do well against armored foes, as the weight could apply some bludgeoning damage. The real issue we have here is the question of whether or not this Claymore sword is representative of real-world Claymore swords, or if this sword is just heavier by default. And that's going to be the real question. Because I'm basing a lot of this by what we see in game, I'm going to assume that this sword is exceptionally heavy for whatever reason. And for that reason, that gives it a very strong offensive capability, able to do damage against even armored opponents, but it's also going to hurt it, because that means that Highlander has to use extra strength to make it useful, and extra energy and power to make it exceptional. The armor of the Highlander does make up for this for pretty decent armor on the chest and arms, but lacking in the legs and head area. They don't really have a helmet to protect themselves, which is going to hurt overall. Otherwise, Highlander does do pretty decently. Number 15, Tandi. Fantastic armor coverage that allows for fast and dexterous movement, strong blade but with moderate reach. The combination of martial skill and striking with a sword will be useful, but the requirement to get in close with an opponent will put them at a slight disadvantage against opponents coming up. However, his ease of movement will allow for evasive maneuvers, and his armor, just chef's kiss. It is an excellent armor coverage, probably some of the best we've seen so far, including the use of a helmet, thank God, and a helmet that actually shows the face, so they actually have much more visibility. I think the issue here is the weapon. The weapon is not going to be much good against a lot of the armored warriors coming up because of its lack of good range and its one-sided nature, and the fact that he does have to use a lot of martial skill to get a lot of use out of it. The weapon has to require some momentum to get that kind of cutting power necessary, and without the reach to compensate for it, it puts the Tandi in some awkward situations. But, hey, they've got the armor to help with that, so there is that to consider. Number 14, Kensei. Actually, Kensei and Tandi are going to be very similar here. Kensei also has excellent armor coverage like Tandi, but makes up for it with longer reaching blade. I would say the Nobushi is a much better blade in this situation because it allows to keep the opponent back and cause excellent defensive maneuvers. The impressive armor coverage allows for Kensei to engage against opponents up close and at a distance. The real problem is that against later opponents, Kensei will struggle against superior range or superior armored opponents. The reason Kensei does better than Tandi is because of the reach of that blade. Both are going to be very well skilled, both are going to be very well trained. Kensei is going to come into this fight with a lot of options and a lot of versatility and just excellent reach. I do think that will be the Kensei's big bread and butter. A lot of you may not see it, but underneath the shirt or cloak that the Kensei has, there is armor, there is protection. So the Kensei is doing very well in the armor department angle. So I think that does help them a great deal. I just think that it's the range of their weapon that gives them the advantage here. Number 13, Conqueror. An effective shield and armor coverage, but an unreliable weapon is what hurts Conqueror here. The flail can be devastating, but also a hindrance if used poorly. Here's the thing. The flail runs a lot of risks in striking back at the wielder or getting tangled. Now, there are a lot of people who come to me saying, "Oh, bro, dude, no. Flail is awesome. Flail is such a good killing weapon. It's so useful. It can be used very well." I agree. Flail is a cool weapon. But it has a risk factor. There is the opportunity for the flail to come back and knock you in the head or cause issues. It could get tangled. It could get caught. There are issues with the flail, plus the fact that you need to wind it up to get a lot of momentum out of it. There's problems that the flail presents that you wouldn't get out of a mace or a club. That's my point there. And for this reason, the shield is essential, and the use of the heater shield means that the Conqueror will be able to hold off and defend against most enemy attacks with ease, as well as the potential of their own flail coming back and hitting them. In fact, watch the Conqueror fight sometimes. You'll notice that he moves his shield up sometimes to block the flail coming back and hitting him. You wouldn't have to do that if you didn't have a flail. Against more powerful and destructive opponents, the Conqueror is just going to suffer. He will find that a lack of a reliable offense could be dangerous, but because of his shield, he will do well against most of the opponents we've talked about previously. Number 12, Jong Jun. Jong Jun's wearing pretty good armor for protection and with a heavy and powerful polearm. The Guandao is usable in versatile situations with powerful swings that can be generated thanks to momentum and ease of use. And the swift and maneuverable aspect of the body and simplicity of the weapon make for a powerful combination. And working in tandem with the armor that the Jong Jun is wearing means that the weapon is more reliable and the armor just as useful. Keep in mind also that Jong Jun are generals. They'll have a lot of experience and a lot of understanding of a battlefield scenario, meaning that they're good tacticians as well, which doesn't really factor into the combination of the armor and weapon here, but I would argue that the use of the Guandao is going to be very, very effective, even against armored opponents, and I think because Jong Jun is armored himself, that's going to help him out in the long run. Number 11, Griffin. Griffin has superior armor to Jong Jun than the scaled armor that we see, but similar weapon and fighting style. Both will use wide striking maneuvers and strike to subdue and incapacitate foes, but the Griffin has slightly more defensive capability with their scaled armor, which puts them a little above Jong Jun. The real issue I have with Griffin is the lack of head protection. They don't have a helmet or anything to protect them in the default armor set. Plus, the thing about the Bardiche to keep in mind is the Bardiche is a strong weapon. I would argue the Guandao is a bit of a better glaive weapon overall because it's not as cumbersome or awkward in shape, but that's not taking away from the Bardiche either. The Bardiche is a pretty exceptional glaive in its own right, so I think that the Bardiche and the Guandao's differences are marginal. It's going to be the armor that makes the difference in whether or not Griffin is better or worse than Jong Jun. The problem is, I think up against this next hero, as we get into the top 10, Griffin just isn't going to match up. That's right, guys. We're going into the top 10. You ready? Let's do it. Number 10, Warlord. A very slight advantage in defense. The Warlord doesn't boast a superior weapon. I think that the glaive weapons of Jong Jun and Griffin are better, but the use of a Viking shield in combination with their sword gives them slightly more options than Jong Jun. The Ulfbert sword is reliable and strong, and their shield can easily deflect and maneuver most strikes aside. Armor-wise, the Warlord is pretty similar to Jong Jun, though they do have a helmet, which is nice. Overall, pretty close in terms of lethality and skill, but taking the edge with the Viking shield. And what I mean to say here is this: I don't think the sword is better than the polearms that we've seen, but the shield is the best defensive tool that we've seen so far. I think the Viking shield is heavily underrated. It is a great, the center grip shield allows for great deflection and mobility with that shield, and then counterattacking with a sword is going to be very useful. I think that Warlord is exceptionally armored, uses an excellent defensive tool, and while the offensive weapon may not be better than what we've seen before, he makes up for it with his defensive tools, which I think's put Warlord in the 10 spot very easily. The problem is against this next opponent, there's going to be a disadvantage that Warlord will not be able to account for. Number 9, Valkyrie. Excellent armor protection, and while not having a better shield than Warlord, the reach of the spear that Valkyrie has provides for a slight advantage. There is a reason why the shield and spear combination is such a good one. Fast thrusting and blocking moves will give the Valkyrie an easy and effective tactic to whittle down opponents, and the smaller shield means less weight to be worried about. If necessary, you could even discard the shield and you could just use the power of a dual-handed spear thrust, and I think that would be very exceptional. Now, some of you might argue that you would say, well, you know, the Warlord shield is superior, so his defense is stronger. I would agree with that, but in order for the Warlord to get in the hits he needs on Valkyrie, he needs to close the distance, and with a spear, Valkyrie's not going to let him do that easily. So I think that Valkyrie has a slight advantage in terms of offensive power, and that's the real ticket here. Plus, as long as Valkyrie has her shield, she has her own defensive capability to hold off the Warlord. Plus, she's armored just as decently as Warlord is, so it's a pretty even match, so you have to come down to who's got the better offense, and I think the spear is better offensively than the sword. Number 8, Aira. The Aira has a similar shield to the Valkyrie, and while the mace has less range than the spear, the Aira have superior steel armor coverage. This comes down to who I think has the better armor, and looking at default Aira, I think their iron or steel armor is superior to the more leather iron armor of the Valkyrie. Not only this, but the mace can be used as a blunt instrument to damage those wearing armor, and thus provides a fair degree of advantage in its use. The rapid striking and retreat tactics that the Aira use will be their bread and butter. I think what we need to keep in mind here is that the use of a mace changes things a little bit. Let's say that a sword got past the shield of the Valkyrie and hit the armor. There's a pretty good chance that the armor would be able to blunt some of that attack and nullify some of the damage. But with a mace like what the Aira uses could still cause some serious bludgeoning, bruise, or even bone-breaking damage, especially if it hits the head. That's something to keep in mind. Bludgeoning weapons are very useful against armored opponents, and that's going to give the Aphira some advantage. Plus, their iron steel armor set gives them even added protection against most of the opponents we've seen so far, but not against who we're about to talk about. Number 7, Black Prior. That huge kite shield puts the Black Prior at a huge advantage over just about everyone we've talked about so far. With the largest shield out of the cast, Prior can hunker down and strike away with his arming sword and just know that he's safe behind that shield. Technically speaking, it would be wiser to give him a spear to have easier reach, but the shield more than makes up for any armor discrepancies. That said now, the Prior does have some armor discrepancies. So what's going to have to happen as we go into later fights is we're going to have to ask the question, would the shield be adequate in holding off these later opponents that we talk about? And if it's not, will the armor be sufficient? To put it in simple terms, I think the shield of the Black Prior would be sufficient to hold off the Aphira's mace, because the range of the mace won't be able to get past the shield, and even if he tried to, the reach of the arming sword is long enough that it would be able to hit the Aphira if they tried. But against the next opponent, Black Prior is going to have a hard time. Number 6, Warden. Far superior armor to Black Prior for one thing, and though he lacks a shield, he uses a heavy longsword which can be used to do serious damage to the less armored Prior. Prior's shield would make for fine defense, but the arming sword would have a difficult time getting through Warden's armor or reaching him. The versatility of the longsword, meanwhile, gives him several options for how to approach his foes, and being able to switch to striking with the hilt and crossguard allows for anti-armor tactics. Essentially, the way I look at this is as follows. If the Black Prior can hold off the Warden using his shield, then the Black Prior may have a chance to hit the Warden with his arming sword. The problem is Warden's armor is going to protect him from that arming sword, so if the Black Prior takes a risk and tries to go on the offense, the Warden has him beat. Black Prior has to stay hidden behind his shield and hope Warden doesn't find a way around it or through it, and it's basically a question of when with the Warden and how with the Black Prior, and that gives the Warden the advantage. But the Warden's going to have a tough time against this next opponent. Number 5, the Venian Guard. This was a hard choice, because I do believe that the Warden's armor is excellent and better than what we see from the Venian Guard. But the use of shield and axe gives excellent protective and striking power. Superior armor to the Prior behind the shield gives added defense against striking, and the axe is a heavy and strong tool able to cause bludgeoning damage as well as cutting power. Even if it couldn't puncture Warden's armor, the opponent would feel that strike in a huge way. I think the problem here that we see is while Black Prior did have a good shield, better than what the Venian Guard has, Warden could get through it and around it eventually and cause damage to the less armored Black Prior. But the Venian Guard has pretty decent armor behind their shield, and even if they didn't, that axe has a longer reach and will cause far more damage to Warden's armor than what the arming sword would do. That's not discounting the arming sword by any means, but that axe was designed to catch an opponent's shield and rip it away, or strike down and cause serious bludgeoning damage to steel plate armor. It's what the axe was meant to do. That axe is a devastating tool, and the Venian Guard have the armor and weapon set to make Warden think twice. And speaking of thinking twice, the next hero to talk about made me and my brother Lark definitely think twice. Number 4, Shugoki. This was very hard to determine, and I know some of you are probably getting upset, but hear me out. He has inferior armor to some of the others mentioned, I grant you, but the Kanabo is an outstanding anti-armor weapon. After discussing it with Lark for a while, we came to this solid conclusion. It's going to come down to who gets the first hit in with these characters. If Shugoki can land his hit first, that's going to really cause damage regardless of armor. If Warden or Venian Guard take a direct hit from that Kanabo, it's going to rattle them regardless of the armor. If Shugoki gets hit first, he's just not armored enough to ensure he can keep fighting at full potential. So, obviously, why does Shugoki take the 4th spot? Because we believe that the strong offensive capability he has to count for something here. He is armored moderately well, but regardless of the opponent's armor, Goki is going to leave an impression. So the way I see it is this. If Goki gets hit, there's a chance he'll make it through because of his armor. It's not great armor, but there is armor. If Shugoki hits you, regardless of armor, you're in for a world of hurt, and Goki's going to make sure of it. Because of that one offensive factor, I did put Shugoki in the 4th spot. If you disagree, again, Lark and I discussed this for a while. We feel comfortable with this, but know that we did have to debate it for a while. So that is why we put him at number 4. But even Shugoki will have trouble with this next opponent. Number 3, Pirate. Pirate has less armor than the other characters, but makes up for this with a pistol. The use of firearms creates a distinct advantage for Pirate, able to fire a round of death into the armors of most of the rest of the cast. Given that Pirate seems capable of firing multiple times without reloading, this would normally make them unbeatable. But let's take even that away from her. Even without that multiple firing capability, the ability to fire just one shot is already giving a huge advantage to Pirate that will be hard for the other fighters to overcome. Only the most heavily armored soldiers could stand up to that kind of punishment. All Pirate has to do, really, is fire her flintlock pistol at an armored or unarmored opponent. If the opponent is unarmored, odds are pretty good that if they're not dead, they're severely wounded and incapacitated, giving the Pirate a huge advantage. And if they are armored, most of the armor that we've seen so far isn't going to be adequate against a flintlock pistol. It's just the nature of firearms. You add a firearm to the cast, already things have changed for the better for the Pirate. But, as I said, Pirate is number 3. There are 2 characters who I think have the armor to not only handle Pirate, but have the weapons to deal a lot of damage. So, who are our last 2 contenders? Number 2, Warmonger. Warmonger boasts some of the best armor in the game with a versatile and devastating blade. The Flamber-style blade on a long Zweihander sword allows for fast and fluid strikes that can easily cut through flesh, and can also send vibrations up and down armor that make the opponent feel the strikes even through their armor. The clawed gauntlets also provide an alternative form of attack without sacrificing exposure. The full, complete nature of their armor means that most opponents' attacking weapons are not going to be much of an issue for them, and even the flintlock pistol would have to shoot directly at a weak spot in the armor to get in, and even then, it's not a surefire kill. Warmonger may be able to power through it. So Warmonger is a very devastating, monstrous weapon on the battlefield. But there is one hero who does outshine her, and that is the number 1 deadliest warrior, Lawbringer. He has won every single deadliest warrior discussion thus far, and for good reason. He has the most complete and all-encompassing armor in the game. Though Warmonger's is similar, Lawbringer also boasts a superior weapon in the poleaxe, which is more versatile, provides a longer reach, and leaves Lawbringer with almost no openings for the opponent to take advantage of. In order for Warmonger to do damage to Lawbringer, not only does she have to get through his armor, she has to get beyond the reach of the poleaxe, which Lawbringer is just not going to let happen. Because of the ultimate weapon that Lawbringer carries and the ultimate armor completion, Lawbringer, from a realistic and historical standpoint, is the ultimate warrior of this cast. Out of all 34 heroes that we've had added to the game, Lawbringer still remains the undisputed deadliest warrior. But, with that said, all of these heroes that we've talked about have earned their spot in the warrior countdown. Even the lowliest Shaolin, who I still think just was not cut out for the deadliest, still really impresses me. What I love so much about For Honor is how we can take these historical warriors and make them stand out on the battlefield, giving them all their own unique personalities, looks, identities, weapons, and styles. Even if your favorite hero didn't make the top spot, still, I think that it was really awesome to be able to talk about them and analyze them and understand where they stood. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope that you liked it. If you disagree at all, I understand. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below. Just be respectful. If you get insulting, I'm going to delete the comment or give you a very fun response. Just, guys, be respectful. This was all for the sake of fun. Lark and I had a fun time discussing it, and we hope you had a fun time watching it. Don't forget to check out the rest of the channel. Subscribe if you haven't already. Be sure to check out my other channel, The Raven's Writing Room, where I do a lot of writing stuff. And as always, guys, I will see you in my next video. Take care.